Hey everybody, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to jump into the iRacing graphics optimization, and I have previously done a video on this probably about a year and a half ago now, but because there's been a big set of changes in iRacing since then, we've had rain, there's been some changes to the INI files, some of the graphics options have changed within the sim itself. It seemed like a good time to come back together and do another top to tail review of all of the settings within the sim, as well as some of the Windows settings that you can configure. And if you have an NVIDIA graphics card, I'll be taking a look at the settings in the NVIDIA Control Panel as well. All of these play a role in helping you get the most out of your system, which is why we're going to look at all of them today. And as always, the video will be broken up into sections so you can easily find the content that you're looking for. I've included an expanded section this time on Windows configuration. You'll find that towards the end of the video, so make sure you don't miss out on that. Some of these changes are things that I've learned about in the last 12 months and could potentially have quite a significant impact on frames per second whilst you're playing the game, so definitely worth checking out before you sign off. But let's start right from the beginning and opening iRacing for the first time. So we're now in the iRacing UI, and the first thing to talk through is the graphics configurator that's built into the system. To find that, you would head down to settings, so bottom left, then you bring up the options and settings menu, head over to the interface tab, and then about halfway down you'll see this button here called graphics config with the help text run graphics config. Now, why is this important? This is a button that I found will solve a lot of problems, either when iRacing goes through a significant update, so often, at the beginning of a new season with significant graphical changes or new content, I found that can sometimes throw my system off. If I've rebuilt my PC, if I've changed hardware, even if I've made significant software changes, like I've done a fresh install of Windows. Running the graphics configurator is a great place just to re-baseline all of the graphics settings in the sim, make sure that the sim understands exactly what hardware you're running and can set the basic settings up appropriately. Now, there is a health warning with this. When you run this graphics configurator, it will wipe out any existing settings that you have already saved. So that's not to say you shouldn't do this, but what's really important is that you make backups of those .ini files, which are the files that this graphics configurator will overwrite. So before I run the graphics config, what I'm going to do is just head into my documents folder. I'm going to jump into iRacing, and then there's basically three .ini files that the graphics configurator will edit once you run it. It is the app.ini file, the core.ini file, and then any of the renderer DX11 files that you might have. Now, I just run on triple screen, so I have a single file monitor, but if you run monitor sometimes, VR other times, you may have multiple renderer DX11 files. So just make sure you make a copy of those. So I'm just going to do a Control C here, stick them on my second hard drive that I have, and then we are good to go. So with those three files successfully backed up, we'll head back into the iRacing UI. We'll come down about halfway and we'll hit graphics config on the right. Now, initially, it's just going to double check that the right display adapter is selected. Now, for me, I only have a single GPU, a 4090, so that's simple. But just make sure if you're running multiple GPUs that the right one is selected that you want iRacing to use when you're in the sim. So just, if you're unsure, do a drop down and just double check. So we'll hit Auto Configure. Typically takes just a couple of seconds, could take a little bit longer depending on your system. And then once it's done, it'll give you an option to select the graphics mode that you want to run by default. Now, typically the one that's pre-selected will be the highest quality that's available based on your hardware. That's exactly right for us, 2560, 1440 HDR at 144 Hertz. That's great. Now that's just for one of my triple screens. So you can't configure triple screens directly in this graphics configurator. That's something we have to do outside of this separately in the INI files. But for now, we can save a little bit of time by telling the sim that we want it to run in a window because that's what we need for triple screens, and we won't want to run a window border. So you hit finish, and then we're good to go. And just to confirm exactly what that will have done, if I come back to my iRacing folder and I scroll down, I appreciate this is a little bit small for you, but what we can see here is the app.ini file, the core.ini file, as well as my renderer DX11 monitor ini file have now all been updated with the latest information. So if I had just done a fresh install of iRacing, or for whatever reason I wanted to regenerate these files using the graphics configurator, I would now typically double click each one of those INI files, go through and manually make adjustments to the settings based on what I know needs to change. That's one way of doing it if you're more of an advanced user. If you're not and you're just getting started for the first time, you can just head straight into the sim itself, load up a test session, have a look at the graphics settings, get a sense of is it showing on the screen in the right way. You know, if you're running triple monitors, just get everything set up on a single screen first, come back out of the sim, and then you'll be able to go through and manually make some of the INI changes to get it projecting as you want across the three monitors. Now, in a previous video, I talked through triple monitor setup in detail, so I'm not going to cover it in here, but I just wanted to give you a full sense of what that graphics configurator does, the fact that it's a really useful tool. It's my first go-to if I'm ever running into stuttering problems, or if I'm ever making any significant hardware or software changes to my PC. But the health warning, as mentioned before, it will overwrite those three .ini files. So just make sure before you hit run on that graphics configurator that take a backup of those three ini files, put them somewhere safe, and then you can always just copy them back across, and then it will be as if that graphics configurator has never run. So let's dive a little bit deeper into the iRacing INI files, and there are a number of them. So if I go into my documents folder, into iRacing, and then just scroll down to the bottom, the ones that you're most likely going to make potential edits to when you're using the sim would be the app.ini file, core.ini file, and the renderer DX11 file. Now, for the purpose of graphics adjustments, you're pretty much always going to be in the renderer DX11 file. And that's great because a couple of years ago, the graphics settings were split across multiple ini files, which is a bit of a pain to find the different ones. But now, pretty much everything you need is going to be in that renderer DX11 file. So that's where you want to head to first. Now, if you didn't listen to the first part of the video, all good. One of the key points that I mentioned there was the importance of making backups of all of these INI files on a regular basis. Some of you might use OneDrive and it's backing up for you automatically, so that's great. Plenty of you probably won't use OneDrive because of the pull on the system, but just make sure from time to time, or especially before there's a significant iRacing update or you're going to make significant changes to your PC hardware or software, that you just come in here, grab the app.ini file, core.ini file, render a DX11 ini file, and just copy them to somewhere where they're going to be safe. It's probably good practice to make a copy and a backup of your entire iRacing folder from time to time, but those three files are critical to maintaining the settings that you've configured in the sim if you have a significant system crash or you need to reinstall the sim, or you're reinstalling Windows. So just a bit of a health warning on that one. So I've gone ahead and I've opened up my renderer DX11 monitor file. You can do exactly the same. You just double click the file. If it does ask you for what program to open with, I suggest selecting Notepad. It's pre-installed on Windows, works just fine. There probably are other programs you can use as well. Once you do open it, this is what you're faced with. It can be quite an overwhelming file when you open it for the first time, but it's actually a little bit simpler than it looks. Everything is broken down into sections, and each one of these settings on the left-hand side has some pretty good corresponding instructions on the right-hand side. Now, for the next 30 seconds, let me just take you through the sections of the file so you understand what it's made up of. And then we can talk a little bit about why you would need to go into these INI files, when it's useful, when it's not, because they can be a little bit complex at times, and it shouldn't be something that you're needing to do on a regular basis. So if we start out with the graphics options section, this section pertains to all of the graphics for when you are actually driving the car in the sims. Anything you change in this section will change how the graphics look when you're in the car, but it won't impact the graphics when you're in the replay mode and when you're watching someone else racing or you're just doing a replay of your own race. So that's something to be aware of. Now, the key thing for this section is it's very complex. There's a huge amount of changes you can make inside this file itself, but most of these settings can just be adjusted from the in-sim UI. And that's generally my recommendation, is to go there first, get the adjustments. You can see the adjustments live because you can make them whilst you're in the sim, so you can see the impact of them, and then you're good to go. The only reason you would really be coming in to adjust graphics settings for in the INI files is if something isn't working or you want some finer adjustment around a graphic setting which doesn't appear in the UI but does appear in this INI file. Now if we scroll down, this dry screen section is very short, but there is one really important setting if you use the virtual mirror. I do, and so I find that the virtual mirror size by default, which is set to medium, I find that a little bit too big for my liking. I prefer it to be a little bit smaller. So this is one of the INI settings that I do make when I come into the file. I'll scroll down and I'll adjust the virtual mirror size and I'll put it to size 2. You can see there's full adjustments here from 0 to 4, but this is interesting because this setting it does not appear in the in-sim UI, so you can't make this setting change anywhere else. So this is one that I always have at the back of my mind when I'm doing a reinstall of iRacing, is to come here and to make that adjustment. Now the user options, display, monitor setup, these are not areas that you would typically need to mess around too much with from a graphics perspective. However, if you're setting up triple screens for the first time, this display section is super important to tell iRacing how your monitors are set up, and indeed the same for monitor setup below. This is where you can tell the sim how many monitors you have, what are the type of monitors you have, the distance you're set away from the monitors, etc., etc. But for both of these sections, a lot of these adjustments can be made in the sim itself. So other than if you're setting up triple screens where you would need to come in here to make adjustments, my recommendation is go to a test session, go into the sim, go into the graphics options, make all of the adjustments in there first, and if you can get the sim looking the way that you want to, then that's super. If for any reason something isn't working the way that you want, just know that this INI file, when you're not in the sim, is another way of making some finer adjustments, just to tweak the settings that aren't working for you. Now, if we scan down to this bottom section, replay graphics, this is very similar to the first section, which I think was called graphics options. There it is. Replay graphics, any changes that you make in this section will impact what you see when you're not inside the car. So when you're in replay mode, when you're watching your own racing, whether you're spectating or watching others race, but whenever you're outside of the car, any of the settings that you make here will impact how the graphics are rendered on your system when you're not in the car. So this is useful, and it's great that iRacing has separate settings for in-car versus replay, because in replay you may be less worried about FPS. So you might be happy to have higher quality graphics, even if the frame rate is lower, maybe it's around 60 to 80. But when you're in the car, typically if you've got a monitor that can refresh, over 100 Hertz or higher, you're going to want to keep those frame rates as high as possible. So you may have lower graphics settings for whilst you're in the car, but in the replay you may push them up a little bit higher. So just useful to know that inside of this INI file there are a bunch of adjustments that you can make, but again my recommendation would always be go into the sim first, make the adjustments within the graphics tabs that are there. You can see the changes live, and really you'd only want to come back into these INI files if there's something specific that you need to change, which you can't make the adjustment of in the sim itself. Okay, so first of all, jump into options. And as I said earlier on in the video, there's basically two places in Sim that you're going to want to make changes. You've got the graphic tab here. This has most of the options, and everything in here under the performance bar, and so in this performance section, this relates to the graphics you're going to see when you're driving the car. So all of these settings drive graphics when you're in the car, when you're driving, and that's great because you can potentially lower the graphics requirements here just to keep a higher frame rate, make sure you don't have stuttering, keep everything nice and smooth whilst you're racing. The second tab to look at will be the replay tab. Now there's different philosophies on what to do on this tab. You know, crank everything to the max because who cares? You don't need frame rate when you're just kind of watching a replay, or do you have them the same so it's kind of similar? You know, there's no real right or wrong answer, but everything that you adjust in this tab will only apply to what you're seeing when you're outside of the car. So when you're watching your own replay, when you're out of the car, watching other cars on track, or indeed if you're spotting others who are currently racing. So those really are the two tabs, and we'll go first into the graphic tab and I'll chat through the settings one by one. So I've jumped us back to the graphic tab, and the first thing we'll take a look at will be this display section right at the top here. Not everything in this section is related to graphics. Some of it is related to monitor setup. So I'll just briefly cover some of that. So the resolution seems like quite a strange resolution, but those of you with triple screens and 1440p monitors will recognize this one. Again, you can't configure that resolution in the sim in the UI. That's something you have to do in the INI files, but this just shows you how I've set it. So that's great. UI zoom, you know, you can adjust that. That's just really how big this screen is. Maybe I'll leave it a little bigger for us as I chat through these settings. Whether you're running a full screen, border, etc. If you're running triple screens, both of those will be unticked. Now this isn't a video that's going to go into any depth on VR. There's lots of great guides out there, but if you are running VR, then you're going to want to leave that ticked. But on the right here, reflex. Now this will only show up if you're running an NVIDIA GPU, but we're running a 4090 here. And generally, there'd be no reason to not have this set to enabled, and I have this set to enabled and boost, just so I can get the maximum performance out of the GPU. Now, I recommend doing a bit of read up around what does NVIDIA Reflex actually do, but in my basic understanding of it, it helps align the CPU and the GPU so you don't get misframes. So it means that when the CPU and the GPU are ready, the frames are drawn at the same time so that they can complement each other. So it should provide as smooth an experience that you're going to get. You're not going to have a case where the CPU is pumping out extra frames that you don't need. They're going to align the frames basically between CPU and GPU. So, you know, I've run it. I probably noticed a small difference in smoothness. I wouldn't say it was earth-shatteringly different when that setting wasn't there before. But nevertheless, if you're running an NVIDIA graphics card, no reason to not have that switched on. Now, if we jump into the monitors tab, most of this is to confirm the physical setup of your monitors, whether you're single screen, triple screen, curved screens, flat screens. So you can see how I've got my setup here, 3 curved screens and all the other bits and pieces. But the two things you do want to make sure that are ticked if you're running triple screens are render scene using 3 projections and then enable SMP MVP. The text underneath when you're hovering over this actually does a pretty good job of explaining what both of these do, so I'm not going to try and get too technical on this, but it is worth double checking if you're running triple screens that you do have both of these ticked. It's just going to make sure you can get the most out of your hardware when you're running triples. Okay, onto the performance section of the page. First thing to bear in mind is this is very much personal preference. You know, some of you will have a preference over higher performance versus higher quality. Some people will have a balance in the middle. And so all of the guidance I'm going to share with you here is what I found works best for me. I probably have a preference towards higher quality, but I always try and make sure that that doesn't come at an unreasonable cost when it comes to performance. And when you're running triple screens, it's almost always a compromise. You know, 4090 is a fantastic GPU, but running three 1440p screens still puts the GPU under quite a bit of pressure, especially when you're running rain or when the environment is cloudy, for example. But if we start on the top left, this slider is slid over to max quality, but that's just where it'll be as soon as you start to edit these settings and play around with them yourself, so you don't need to worry about that too much. But if we go top down, and again, every one of these settings, you know, if you look at the tooltip, there's usually some quite decent information in it. If I have anything else to add, I'll share it as we go through, but do have a quick scan of those because it can be quite useful. And again, this is when we're in the car. So sky clouds, you know, low detail for me can create a little bit of jumpiness in the sky. So I don't like that. I mean, it's a performance benefit. So it's something you can do if you're struggling to kind of keep your frame rates up. I found the difference between high and medium to be fairly negligible when I'm driving. So medium seems to be the right setting for me. So I think that's a reasonable trade-off between performance and quality. Now for the cars, no brainer. This is always going to be high detail for me, whatever the cost. I'll make savings elsewhere just because that provides the richness for me when I'm driving. I want, you know, the maximum amount of detail as possible. Pit objects. It took me a while to learn what the different settings really do here. But, you know, if you go down to low detail or off, you're just going to see less in the pit lane. You're going to see less people in the pit lane. So, of course, in a big race where you've got a lot of pits visible, that can really save you some performance as you're driving by them. That said, you also take away quite a bit of the realism. So for me, medium again is a good balance here. If you put high detail on, all that does is create some movement behind the pit lane. So the individuals you've got in your pit box will start to sway and look like they're having conversations. That's not really something I'm too worried about when I'm driving, so I set that to medium detail because you still get the individuals in the pit lane, but they are static. Again, good compromise for me. Event detail, you know, as it says at the bottom here, you know, if you lower it, it'll reduce the object complexity around the track. For me, that's a realism aspect that I want to keep high, so I always keep that high. Again, good way to save frames, you know, if you're really struggling, but I do think it's at the cost of a little bit of realism there. So if you can, I think keeping that to high is great for the immersion. Now, grandstands and crowds. These for me are really no-brainers to be low detail. Both of these are really demanding for the GPU to draw, especially in race conditions when they're full of people. They only have off, low, and high, and then crowds also has a medium. Grandstands, if you put it on high, it's a real drag on the GPU in terms of the complexity and the drawings that it's got to do. Honestly, when you're driving, how often are you really looking at a grandstand? So I do like to have them there, so I put them on low, but I think high detail would just be a kind of a waste of time unless, you know, you're really comfortable with the frame rates that you've got already. Crowds, kind of the same deal. I think medium is a nice balance because you do get the 3D characters, and low, you're really only getting the 2D faces. But again, for me, when I'm driving, I can't see them, you know, or at least I'm not looking for them. So low detail keeps them there in the background, but it vastly reduces the complexity and the work that the GPU has to do. Objects. This is just like event and cars for me. This is high detail because I think it has an impact on realism and immersion when I'm driving. You only have off, low, and high. So for me, I keep this at high, and I will find other ways to save. As it says, you know, it's trackside objects rendering at low levels of detail. But when you're thinking about braking markers, you know, I want everything as in high detail as possible that's kind of around the edges of the track, because if I'm using it as a braking marker, if you're in low detail, maybe that object won't appear, which wouldn't be ideal. Now, foliage, this is an interesting one. I've played around with all of these settings, and I'm yet to decide really what's best for me. I've run races in high detail, seems fine. I've run it at low detail, seems fine. I'll be honest, I don't know how much difference I can really tell when I'm in the sim, when I'm driving between these different detail levels, even when it's off, to be honest. I think this will have more of an impact when you are in the replay section and you're watching and you're taking in a bit more of what you're seeing. But I've settled on medium because, sure, if I'm going to be next to the grass, I wouldn't mind a little bit of detail. I don't go for high because I couldn't really tell the difference, if I'm honest, between high and medium. So I just went for the one in the middle. But I have to say, I think it's good, but I don't know how much impact this has when you're driving. So you could probably even leave this to off, and I don't know if it would make a huge difference. It does cost some GPU power, of course, so it's a way to make savings. For me, medium just kind of works. Particles, I keep this in high detail. Again, just a realism thing. If you lower these, that's great. You'll definitely get some GPU capacity back, but this can impact things like smoke and other things happening whilst you're driving. So again, for the sake of realism, if you can keep this on high detail, I would recommend it. Okay, so just tie off the rest of this area here. We've got full res for the particles, and again, this, if you're going for high detail in particles, that's just going to make them seem as smooth as possible. So, that again, bit of a no-brainer for me. But for the remainder of these settings, max cars 63. I don't think this is the default, but if you are running overlays and you want to make sure your lap timing is always up to date, then you'll need to set this to 63 anyway. Of course, if you pull this number down, there will be less cars that need to be drawn by the sim, so that will save you some frames. But again, I want to make sure that the sim has all of the cars available to draw should we need them. So I set this to the max, which is 63. However, these two settings can be useful. I do pull these down from the default. This is how many cars you want to be able to see when you're driving. I have it set to 30. And then how many cars in the brackets do you want to see in your mirrors? I find that's a reasonable balance, so I can always see 8 in my mirrors. Same for the pits, 20 pits and then 8 pits in my mirrors. You can bring this right down if you choose to do so. And what it will do is it'll make sure the cars closest to you, obviously, are the cars that it's drawing, but you really do have some flexibility to pull it right down. Draw min cars, you can get it all the way down to 20 and 4. For the sake of realism, I don't bring this down too much, but I don't need like 40 cars in my mirror. I'm not sure what the top setting is. Yeah, you could have 64 cars and 30 in your mirror. For me, this has been a balance that I'm quite comfortable with, so that I can always see 30 cars around me, and then 8 in my mirrors, and then the pits. I brought down a little bit too. Now, dynamic LOD, I never used to change this for the first couple of years when I was driving, and I would go with the default values here. And again, the non-technical explanation of what this is doing is if your frame rates drop below a certain number, so here it's set to 60, then the dynamic level of detail will start to provide lower levels of detail for certain objects in order to keep your frame rate high. The challenge for me when the sim is doing this is you can get sort of glitches in the distance if you're looking carefully, and I don't really like that. I'd rather take a drop in FPS, keep everything smooth, and then for it just to return as you get to a less complex area of track. So I turn this off entirely, but again, as a way to save get extra FPS, reduce some GPU power, you could absolutely leave these on. I think it's probably negligible, how easy it is to spot when dynamic LOD is active, but it was enough for me in rain and some races I've done over the past 6 months that I just decided, you know what, I'm going to take it off. I'm okay if my frame rate dips a little bit. It's only going to do it in certain areas of the track, rather than having the sim sort of, add lower detail to certain aspects as I'm driving around. Finally, on this column, frame rates. This, for me, doesn't really matter because I have NVIDIA Reflex enabled, so that's going to automatically cap my frame rate at 138. You'll notice that I have set my own limit to 140. This is a bit of a backstop for me. If for any reason NVIDIA Reflex is failing or not working properly, I don't want the sim to then, produce as many frames as it can, because my monitor only can produce 144 frames per second anyway. So I add this additional artificial limit of 140, but in reality it should never be active because NVIDIA Reflex is already capping my frame rate at 138. So moving on to this center column, a lot of what you're going to find in here is really settings connected to overall texture quality or shadow quality. There's some interesting ones in here, and there's some absolute no-goes as well towards the bottom of this column, which you don't want to be switching on. But if we go top down, anisotropic filtering, keep it to the max at 16x, really regardless of the system that you're running. You get good performance at all levels, but there's no need to sacrifice quality here, so keep that at 16x. Now, MSAA samples, this certainly has more flexibility in it, and I think I would be adjusting this up or down depending on the overall quality of the system and your target FPS. Now, my recommendation here, you can see you've got off, 2x, 4x, 8x. First of all, in my testing, in order to see the impact of FPS, you've actually got to change that setting, jump out the sim, reload another test session, even though it doesn't say it here. At least that's my experience. So just know that if you play with it in the sim, I don't think you'll see an impact until you reload. Now, mine is set at 4x, and for me, that's the best balance between quality and performance. Simple as that. I have tried 8x, and it's a real hit on performance. Now I'm running triples, so of course if you're only running a single screen, maybe you could get away with that. So it's again worth trying, see what your experience is like. But for me, the visual quality trade-off between 4.8 and 8x, is minimal. So I would stick with 4x as your maximum. I think you're not getting much value at all if you jump up to 8x. However, if your system is struggling a little bit, or if you're looking to claw back some FPS, drop it down to 2x, even try it with it off. Obviously, you're going to lose some of the detail. You're going to see more of the jagged edges as you're losing some of the anti-aliasing, but it really has a significant impact on frame rate. So something worth playing with, depending on the performance that you want from the system versus the performance that you're currently getting. Now, as we head further down, render dynamic track data, critical to keep this on. This is going to show you the rubber, marbles, and dust, as it says in the tooltip below. So I can't think of any reason why you would turn this off. Yes, it of course consumes a little bit more GPU, CPU, but find other ways to save on your graphics processing, because you're going to lose visual references if you turn this off. So definitely keep that ticked. Now, the other ones that I have ticked here, shadow maps, object self-shadowing, night shadow maps. This is very much eye candy, in my opinion. If you want shadows to look sharp, to look good, then you do want these ticked on. This is the balance that I've ended up with, just going down to object self-shadowing, only having the objects dynamic in the main view. You can see here you can add to the mirrors as well, but of course that is at the cost of performance. And then I've got night shadow maps on, but I don't have them on for walls. So for me, even with triples, this is a pretty good balance. It of course does hit the frame rates. When you're driving at night, you do notice them come down a little bit, but I really like the realism that provides. Adding on the shadows from the walls, sure, can be nice. I don't notice it too much when I'm driving, to be honest. So if your system can handle it, I think this is a really nice sort of level of settings to add in order to get that good immersion feeling when you've got shadows around. But equally, if you're struggling, these are great ways to save FPS, especially if you do a bunch of racing at night. Now, as we get lower here, now the number of lights, if you lower the number of lights, then that's less lights that will cast a shadow. So again, GPU improvement or frame rate improvement, I should say. For me, I keep it at 3, which I think is the default on the max quality setting. And as I said, create some good realism. I'm quite happy with that. But, your usage may vary. Try 1, 2, 3. I don't think I'd go any more than 3. I think that would be overkill, and I doubt you would get the quality versus performance benefit. But again, a setting that you can certainly play around with to release a bit more performance. The dynamic and fixed cube maps, frame rate killers, not 100% sure what they do, but I definitely keep those off. Shader quality, keep to ultra, as it's not much of a performance hit, so just keep that on ultra detail. And of course, hide obstructions. I have the cockpit halo hidden, but that's purely user preference and has no impact on graphics performance. Next up, let's head to the right-hand side. A couple of interesting settings in here, so let's just again go top to bottom. The very first one, this is user preference. I don't think this really has any impact on GPU, CPU performance. It's just to do with the steering wheel. Do you want to hide it? Do you want a static steering wheel? Do you want to show it, etc.? I have mine set to show only if it has display. Two-pass trees, high-quality trees. This is an interesting one. In the past, I have run with both of these ticked, but I do find as the tracks are getting a bit more detailed in iRacing, especially some of the ones that have been recently rescanned and they've improved the, let's say, the vegetation and the number of buildings and objects that they place around the track. If it's a track with a lot of trees, I do find that the trees have a bit of an impact on frame rate and can be quite taxing for the GPU. So in the last couple of months, I've made a bit of an adjustment here. I have switched off two-pass trees. I don't think I gain a huge amount in terms of visual fidelity with it on, but I can definitely notice the performance impact. Yeah, it's probably not huge, maybe 4 to 5 SPS, but that can add up over the course of a race, especially if it's a track where there are lots of trees to render. So again, play around with your settings, but just know that this can definitely bring your frame rates up a little bit. So just have a play with that and just see if you notice the difference, see if it matters to you to have that on. So I have it down, or off, sorry. And then for high quality trees, this again, it does have a frame rate impact. I'd wager that it's maybe not as much as two-pass trees based on when I've done a few quick tests. Again, worth trying to see what your experience is like. But I do tick these because I can notice the difference with them switched on or off, maybe minor. But I keep the high quality trees on and two-pass trees off. But I would just trial and error this, you know, head to a track where there's a ton of trees. The one we're at here, actually, VAR does have a lot of trees, so it's quite a good test for it. And just jump out in the car, put the trees on, take the trees off, you know, and just kind of see the difference, see if you prefer it with or without, and then just, of course, keep an eye on the FPS. Cockpit mirrors. These can be frame rate killers, but again, it's really personal preference. If you want to go high performance and sort of lowest fidelity, if you like, on the quality, then I would switch these to 0. You can just kind of hit the left button, it'll take it down to 0. And then you are just relying on the virtual mirror, which is absolutely fine. So I kind of have a mix of both. I do like to see my wing mirrors, so that's why I have these set to 2, because then it will always render both wing mirrors. But you can see down here that I also do have the virtual mirror on, but I do bring the FOV for the virtual mirror down to 45. And it is something that will have a bit of an impact on FPS, because the higher FOV that you run, then the more of the, I guess, background and what's behind you will show up in the mirror, so therefore it's more taxing on the GPU to draw it. If you get it down into the 40s and the 50s, it does make quite a bit of a difference actually. You will notice a frame rate improvement, pulling it down from the sort of 80s, 90s down to the 45. But of course, the reason I can do this is because I have my wing mirrors, so I am using those to see what's beside me. If you are not running wing mirrors, you are typically going to want your mirror FOV, your virtual mirror FOV, to be much higher, because that's going to enable you to see what's around the side of the car as well. So something to bear in mind. Higher detail in mirrors, I mean, it tells you in the tooltip, it says this is basically a setting you shouldn't switch on because it doesn't provide a ton of value, but it will impact frame rate, so keep that off. Headlights, this is a bit of an impact. If you don't do a ton of night driving, then it probably doesn't matter so much for you, but if you're doing dusk or dawn or night races, then you will notice a difference here. High, medium, I don't think you'll see a huge difference in graphic fidelity, so play around with those. Obviously, if you go to low or disabled, then you're going to improve your frame rates. You will still see headlights behind you, so don't worry, you can still see the car lights, but this is just a level of detail that you're going to see them in. As I said, it's probably a cheap way to save some FPS if you're doing a lot of running at nighttime and you kind of need that extra performance. The last couple, and then we'll talk about SSR, because that's quite a big one, especially with the introduction of rain. But before we get there, some motion blur. This again is post-processing, so it will affect performance. I'm not a big fan of that when I'm driving, so I always keep that off. I think I've tried it once or twice. Didn't like the effect, so for me, kind of has no value. Feel free to try it, but I wouldn't recommend running with that on. Anti-aliasing, recommendation to keep this off. You've got MSAA samples here, so especially if you're already running 2 or 4x MSAA, so you already have anti-aliasing active, there should be no reason to then add more post-processing on by switching this setting on as well. You can try it, you can see the impact to the FPS, but my recommendation here is always to keep that off. Right, onto SSR, otherwise known as screen space reflections. Now, I'm pretty sure that this option was added to the UI at the same time rain was added to the sim back in January or February, whenever it was, earlier this year. There's a chance it may have been a setting before then. I certainly didn't know about it before then, and it is to do with the reflection that you see in puddles, so therefore, it is connected to the rain in the sim. Now, the key thing to note here is the default, I think, is off, so that's great. So if you've never seen it before, probably your setting is set to off, and that's a good thing because SSR has a significant impact on GPU processing and therefore a significant impact on FPS. And that is compounded if you're running in VR or if you're running with triple screens. So I've had a lot of fun, I guess, with this over the last month or so. I've really played around with it in the rain and even in the dry, because as you can see here, you've got 4 different settings. You've got low, high, and those would just be rain only, or you have low and high always. And I was really trying to get a feel for when I'm driving the car, is this a setting I need? Is it giving me visual references? Is it improving the overall immersion? And then equally in the replay screen, how much value is it providing there? What I can tell you from oodles of testing, especially even in the last couple of weeks actually, is I do not see the value of running it whilst you're in the car. The effect with it on, you do notice the difference. You certainly notice the FPS decrease. For me, it's almost always a minimum of 10 FPS drop. It can be as much as 20 FPS from what I've experienced on different tracks in different conditions. And it's not even only when it's raining or raining hard. As long as there's any standing water on the track, SSR will have a really significant impact on what the GPU is having to draw and process. So I've come to the conclusion that whatever the visual benefits of running it, and for me they're pretty minor, it is absolutely not worth the trade-off in performance when you're in the sim and driving, because you want those high frame rates, you want everything to be smooth, and SSR is just a frame rate killer. Now I have slightly different guidance when we get into the replay section, but my short answer to this one is feel free to try it. If you just want to get a sense of what it's like, try low rain only and get into a test session where it's raining. That's where you'll be able to see it most obviously from in the car, so you can put it on rain only, do a couple of laps, come back in, turn it off, see what it's like, but keep an eye on your FPS. If you're running triples or you're running VR, it's a really significant impact. For me, just not worth it. It seemed to have a bigger impact than almost any other single setting in the graphics. And as I said, for me, the trade-off in terms of visual quality wasn't there. You can still see water on the track without this off. All it's really doing for you is creating additional reflections in those bodies of water, which can look cool, but honestly, when you're driving, made absolutely no difference to me. And just to wrap up the rest of this section, most of this is personal preference. They will add a little bit of GPU impact. Generally, I think it's video memory. So if you have a GPU which is low on video memory, do be aware that ticking any of these boxes is going to create, potentially a bit of constraint there. I run a 4090. I have plenty of headroom when it comes to video memory, so I do have a few of these ticked on. Sharpening is on for me. It just works better. I think everything is a little crisper than when it's off, so I run that. I run HDR monitors and have that switched on, so of course I have the HDR setting ticked here as well. Now this is a bit of a weird setting, HDR, because even if you are running just a standard SDR display or multiple displays, HDR still can improve the picture quality. This is probably personal preference though, so I would just jump in the sim, switch it on, see if you like it, switch it off, see if you like it, and keep an eye on the FPS as well, because ticking this on should consume some additional FPS, which if you're not getting the visual quality out of it that you want, then it's probably not worth keeping this ticked. Distortion, heat haze, these fall into the same categories. I'm not a big fan of running these whilst I'm driving, don't feel like it adds much to the immersion. Personal preference, of course. And then these other ones here. The key one that I have ticked is these 2048 by 2048 car textures. If you don't tick this, the cars and the liveries just don't look great. So again, this is one of those settings to always tick and try and make up performance ground elsewhere in the screen here. But otherwise, you're going to start to lose some of that realism because the crispness of the cars will be lost. Something that you can do and is often switched on by default is this video mem swap high res cars. What this will do, I mean, it says it in the tooltip, the 3 closest cars to the camera will render with high quality textures, and as the cars change, the high res versions of the car, they swap into video memory as required. If you're struggling with video memory, again, this is a great option to tick. If you're not, and you've got plenty of video VRAM, untick this because you don't really need it. And again, you can get some of those potential flickers as the quality of those textures is kind of changing depending on the cars around you. So switching over to the replay tab, a couple of things before we get started. Just as a reminder, these settings here will only impact the graphics when you're outside the car. So if you're trying to make adjustments to what you see whilst you're driving, make sure you jump back to the graphic tab, make the changes in there. But anything you change in this replay tab is only going to impact when you're outside the car, like I am right now, when you're spotting someone else, when you're watching other people racing, whatever it may be, but it will have zero impact when you're in the car and driving yourself. So just bear that in mind. The other thing, which I didn't mention in the prior section, but is just worth a little heads up, you can actually see the .ini file that you're editing. Or at least where the changes that you make in the sim are going to be reflected in that INI file. I run triple screen, so this is always the same INI file for me, render a DX11 monitor. If you're running VR or some other combination, just always keep an eye on that so that you know whatever changes you're making here, you can find the requisite file in your iRacing documents folder where those changes will show up. Okay. So let's do a quick tour of the graphic settings here. Now, if you jump straight to replay, just know I am going to go through this fairly quickly because a lot of these obviously are duplicated from the graphic screen. So if you do want to get a better understanding of my opinion on all of these individual settings, you're probably going to need to jump back to the prior section on the video and just kind of skip through to the particular bits that are relevant to you. But as a general sense, this is how my in-car versus out-of-the-car settings are different. And you actually see that there's not a ton of difference between the two. Now, I have in the past just set everything in the replay screen to max because I'm like, who cares? I'm not chasing FPS here. If I'm streaming at 60 FPS. So as long as I'm above that, does it really matter? But the reality is it's still asking an enormous amount of the system. I still feel like it can introduce very minor stutters. And of course, it doesn't matter because you're not driving, but I feel like it still does impact the overall experience of watching a race. So I actually just carry through a lot of the settings that I've road tested to death, to be honest, in the in-car graphic settings, and they bring them over here. But let's just chat through a couple of them. So sky clouds, the same. I don't think there's enough of an advantage even in replay mode to set that to high. Medium works just fine for me. And obviously when you are watching outside, you might see more of the sky. So of course that could have a bigger effect. Cars, high detail, no brainer. You want that to be max all of the time. Pit objects is an interesting one. You can introduce movement behind the pits if you select this to high, and so you could argue that when you're watching a race, that actually is quite nice, adds some realism, when the camera is panning by the pits, or if you're just watching a pit stop. So personal preference, I you know, I kind of go between both. I'm set to medium at the moment just because, you know, it's always such a pull on triple screens on 1440p, and it doesn't add a ton for me. But it's also not a huge frame rate killer, so I could run it high. It wouldn't be a huge impact, but just something to play with. Event, high detail. I want to see everything that they kind of have to offer in terms of the surroundings of the track, so I always keep that high in replay. Grandstands, though, I still have low in the replay. I mean, a couple of reasons. One, it's just a real frame rate crusher because of the level of detail that the grandstands have on iRacing. And honestly, it is super cool. But if you are doing a night race, you know, let's say Daytona, and you've got all of those grandstands, it really suffers. And whilst, yes, you might not care so much because you're just in replay mode, I don't know. I can live with low detail in the grandstands because you're usually far enough away that it's not such a visual impact. The crowds is different though. I have low in the in-car settings and I have medium here, and it's because in low you just get the 2D characters, and obviously when you're watching a replay that kind of sucks as the camera pans around. So medium renders full 3D characters, and I think that's really what you should have when you're spectating a race. You could argue that having high would be fine. That adds additional individuals around the track as well. Again, for me, that doesn't add a ton of extra realism at the cost of performance. So medium works just fine for me here. Objects, a bit like event, I want that maximum detail. You know, any objects around the track, I want to have full detail, especially in replay mode. And then foliage, if you've watched the graphics section or the in-car section, I struggle with this one as much outside the car as I do inside the car. I can't really tell the difference, especially between medium and high, even when I'm spectating. I do want the foliage on for sure to get that extra detail when I'm outside the car, but I've put this on medium as well because I don't know if there's enough value, again, for the cost of performance to have it on high versus having it on medium. So that's just a compromise I make. Particles, high detail, full res, you know, same kind of guidance on the in-car tab, just that I want maximum detail around smoke and those sorts of effects. And then I have the same settings underneath here around the cars that I want to see drawn on the track, and I turn off dynamic LOD just so that we don't have those instances where the frame rate will drop below 60, which on triple screens when you're spectating often can happen quite a bit, especially if you've got a full grid. I would just rather the frame rate can drop below 60 rather than have kind of textures flick in and out in the distance as the game is trying to adjust to keep your FPS above 60. Onto this middle section with the shadows, I basically follow the same guidance that I shared in the previous section. I think if you have a system that can support this and has enough performance, you can find a nice balance by having some of this object self-shadowing on and finding a balance between visual fidelity and overall performance. So this works for me. You know, I'm on triples. If I was on single screen, maybe I would go the whole hog here and tick walls as well. But, you know, I've always got to be conscious around just the work that the GPU is doing when I'm racing, or in this case, when I'm spectating races. But number of lights, same guidance. You know, if you want to try and save a few frames, bring that down. But again, if you can support 3, I think that's great. Would not advise going over 3. Don't think you get the value in term versus performance for making that change. Dynamic and fixed cube maps, always off. Complete frame rate killers. It is unclear to me the value they provide, so I would never switch those to anything else other than 0, which should be the default value. Maybe that will change over time, I'm not sure, but always leave them to 0 for now, otherwise it'll just crush your frame rate. Hide obstructions, of course, personal preference, has no impact whatsoever on the graphics performance. And then if we jump over to the final column on the right, real quickly, again, this show driver arms, personal preference. So whilst in the car, I don't really want to see driver arms because, you know, I'm driving myself, of course. But when I am spectating, yes, I want to see driver arms because I, you know, want to get a sense of realism when I'm jumping in other people's cars. 2-pass trees is interesting. Obviously, high quality trees is already selected from the graphics tab. I'm kind of in two minds. I'm at VIR right now, and this place has a lot of trees, and I do find by clicking two past trees it does eat some frames. And again, I just struggle to see if it really makes that much difference in terms of the visual quality and the overall immersion. So currently I'm running with this off, but truth be told, I kind of sometimes have it on, sometimes have it off. Again, just purely personal preference on that one. Cockpit mirrors, I max this out. I want to see everything. I'm going for pure immersion here, more than anything else. The challenge, of course, is that is absolutely at the cost of frame rate. I don't care so much when I'm in replay mode. I'm not chasing frames, so if I'm averaging closer to 80 rather than 130, no big deal. But I like to switch all of those on. But it's really the same guidance as when you're in the car. Depending on the realism that you're after, set that number to as high as you think is reasonable for your system. But you do lose a little bit of realism when you're spectating if you just have black on some of the mirrors, from my perspective. So yeah, if you can, I'd throw that on 4 because it makes for a much better viewing experience when you're outside of the car. Before we get on to SSR, just quickly on motion blur and anti-aliasing. Again, I go into a bunch of detail in the previous section of the video on in-car graphics, so this will just be a flyby, but if you want to hear a bit more of my opinion, just jump back to that prior section. But motion blur post-processing, so of course it's going to add extra work for the GPU to do, but again, you're not chasing frames in a replay. So if this is an effect that you like, if it works well kind of on your stream, if you're broadcasting, then these are really interesting settings to try. You can basically just switch it to low, medium, high, or ultra strength. They will all have a requisite impact on FPS and kind of GPU complexity. So worth playing around with. I am not really a photo video expert, so I just keep them off. But I have seen people's streams with them running, and they can look pretty cool if you get them right. It may be at the cost of some other settings in order to balance out the FPS and keep things smooth, but purely personal preference. But again, will of course have a GPU impact. Anti-aliasing. Now, on this screen, it appears as though this is the only anti-aliasing being applied, but just remember, on this graphic screen here, you've already set potentially MS AA samples, so that's anti-aliasing to a particular level. For me, it's at 4x. So for me, the guidance on this extra one, as it would be on the in-car graphic setting, is to keep it off. Don't think there's any reason to put this on anything else other than off, especially if you're already running MSAA. So it's just going to add GPU complexity. I think the value you're going to get for switching this on is pretty minor, but the cost in performance will be noticeable. So it's not something I would recommend. Okay, so on to SSR, otherwise known as screen space reflections. So this is generally going to have an impact when you are running in a wet race, when there's water on the track, when there's bodies of water around. And the reason is because this particular setting controls what reflections you can then see in those bodies of water. I mentioned in the in-car graphics, I don't see a ton of value in running this, so I don't keep them on. I just don't think it's worth the frame rate cost. But my guidance is a little different in the replay. We're not in a wet session here, but if you are in a session where it's raining hard and there's a ton of water around and you're in the replay view, there are noticeable differences in visual quality from off, which is really no reflections, to low, through to high. Of course, they all have an increasing level of impact in terms of GPU processing. However, there is good visual fidelity. Like if you have the high setting on and you go into a replay and you kind of drive past a puddle, you can very clearly see the reflection of your paint, for example, of your car in that puddle. You can see it in low, but it's not as crisp and clear. And of course, with off, you don't see it at all. So whilst in the off setting, it is the absolute best in terms of performance, and you still see the rain, you still see the puddles on the track, you just don't get the reflections in them. I actually think, as long as it doesn't crush your system too much, that it is worth trying either low or high, in rain only setting, just so that you can just get a little bit more realism in the wet. Now, however, the health warning. Out of every graphic setting that I've played with, I think this is the single one that has the biggest impact, i.e. negative impact on overall FPS. For me, if we go from high rain only, high always, which is what I've got on at the moment because we're not in a wet session. I'll just come back out to the sim. So what are we averaging here? 82, 83. Let's call it 82. Well, let's call it 83. Just about got there. And that is with SSR high always. If we just switch that directly to off, then we will get an immediate 10 FPS boost. And that is with relatively low complexity here because we don't have a ton of rain. I have noticed in a wet session where it's raining heavily, where there's a ton of puddles, that if I switch that between off and between high, it can be as much as 20 FPS impact. So that is the reason why I never recommend to run it when you're driving in the car, because it's so unpredictable and it'll cause huge variations in your FPS as you're driving, which isn't great. But even in the replay setting, be careful with it, because again, if you were streaming and you want to keep everything smooth, just know that if you have it in the high setting, it can have a real impact. Now for me, I do quite like it, and at the moment I'm trying it in the setting where I have it high rain only. I don't see a ton of value running it kind of always, but when it is in the rain, the difference between low and high, there is a performance impact, but I also think the visual quality is really good actually in the high setting. As I said, the crispness of those reflections in the puddles is something that's pretty cool. So this is the balance that I've kind of got to. Bear in mind, I'm running a 4090. Yes, I'm running triples 1440p, but I do have a reasonable amount of horsepower. But even with all of that, I'm not running full detail on all of the settings. I think there's always a balance to be struck. iRacing is getting better in terms of its overall visual quality. It's not at the level of some of the more modern sims that are out there, but just take the time to try and dial in the settings on the replay, and don't assume that because it's a replay and because you don't care about FPS, the default answer should be just to throw everything on high and not worry about it. I think there is value in kind of working through setting by setting, making some adjustments, and just seeing what is the right balance for your system. It's super easy when you're setting up the sim in iRacing to focus all of your energy on the in-sim graphics and replay options, and basically how to adjust those settings and testing them ad nauseum, and that's a fantastic thing to do. It's a great way to optimize the system. But over the past 12 or so months, I've noticed that there are a number of settings within Windows itself that you just want to keep an eye on and make sure that they're switched on, make sure they're configured in the best way for your system. And that's why I'm just going to dedicate a little bit of time here to talking through the settings that are my go-tos basically when I'm kind of rebuilding my system, or just making sure, if I'm having issues in the sim, that all of these settings are set the way that they should be. So it'll be a bit of a whistle-stop tour as we go through them. First up, there has been a Windows cumulative update that released probably about a month ago at the time of releasing this video. If you're running Windows 11, this will apply to you. If you're running Windows 10, it will not. But if you're running Windows 11, just know this update, KB504157, it should already be installed on your PC by now, unless you are deferring updates. But if you're running a Ryzen processor, this specific Windows update will help with improvements around branch prediction. I don't have a ton of background as to exactly what that means technically, but what I do know is it will buy you some free FPS effectively. It's going to optimize the way our Ryzen CPUs are working, and whether it's a 7800 X3D, 5800 X3D, or really anything that has been released by AMD, it's a Ryzen processor in the last probably 3 to 5 years, this will have a positive impact. So just double check that if you're running Windows 11 that this update is installed. Next off, OneDrive, love it or hate it. When you install Windows, it's pretty much forced upon us. I actually don't mind it too much. I do use that as my main backup for documents, my iRacing folders. However, I do have it set to either off or pause whilst I'm racing. To make it easy for myself, I just turn it off as a startup program, and then I just switch OneDrive on from time to time when I want it to basically take a backup of anything on my PC. But I don't recommend having OneDrive running at the same time you're running iRacing, or indeed any sim, just because of the potential for it to take up a little bit of RAM, be doing things in the background that you don't want. So just know, if you have a Microsoft account, it's often on by default, so either switch it off from the startup program so it doesn't start when you turn on your computer, or just hit pause every time you jump into the sim. Next up, Microsoft Edge settings. I think the performance impact here is probably negligible, but even so, on some systems, every little bit counts. If you open up Microsoft Edge, you go into settings and you go into the performance menu in settings. There's a couple of options in there that you just want to take a look at. It'll sometimes have startup boost enabled by default. That's just going to grab a little bit of RAM, potentially a very small amount of processing power, but it's not something you need when you're sim racing, because all it really does is allow Edge to start up faster. So I typically turn that off. And the second setting is related to any plugins that you might have attached to Edge and whether they continue running in the background when you close Edge. Again, just a needless use of additional memory perhaps, so you can just switch that setting off as well. Next up is optimizations for windowed games. This is a standard setting now in Windows 11. It may also exist in Windows 10, just not 100% sure. And I think by default this is usually switched on, but I'm not 100% sure, and I recommend, if you're ever reinstalling Windows, even just reinstalling iRacing or making any sort of hardware changes, just double check that this is switched on, especially if you're running triple screens, you're running in windowed mode. We want Windows to basically give us the best performance we can, and this setting will just kind of give us a little bit of help in that area. Where you find that is in settings, system, display, go down to the graphics menu, and then you can see there's a couple of options to look at here. But if you go to change default graphics settings, there's a couple of things in here, but just make sure the optimizations for window games is set to on. What is the level of impact? Don't know. Have never really tested it off and on. I just always make sure that this is on, knowing that I run triple screens and therefore I'm always in a window display. But it certainly can't hurt, so I'd always recommend just double check that that's ticked it on, just so that Windows gives you the best performance when you're running games in a window. For the next one, we're going to head in a slightly different direction, but still in Windows. This time, you want to head to your security center, probably called Windows Security. Not sure if it's called something different on Windows 10. And this setting could possibly apply to Windows 10 as well. It most certainly does apply to Windows 11. But once you're in Windows Security, just head through to Device Security. You're going to see a number of things in here. May not look exactly the same as mine. I have core isolation, security processor, and secure boot. It is core isolation that you want to focus on, so we're going to click into here, and this is where you've got a memory integrity slider from off to on. If you run this on, this has a negative impact on gaming. It may only be 1 to 5 FPS, but it will slow down gaming on PCs, different games, different amounts. Now, the health warning here is by switching it off, you are technically creating a bit more of a vulnerability on your PC, or let's just say you're turning off a potential security measure. So please do your research, go into that, understanding what you're doing. There's a learn more button here that you can click just to understand exactly what it's going to do. I choose to run it off because my PC is purely for gaming. I'm not doing any sensitive work on here, so I'm comfortable with whatever level of risk this introduces. And for me, I want to get the maximum FPS. So this is a sort of a risk-based decision that I make. You may want to make a different one, but just know this is something that if you've left it on and you don't feel that you need it on, will be having a negative impact on your FPS in game. As I said, probably not huge, but could easily be up to 5, maybe a little bit more FPS as you're running the sim. So I've got two final areas to cover before we close out the Windows settings section. The first one is there's a program on every Windows PC and it's called Event Viewer. Until I started building PCs, I had never heard of it. I had no idea what it did. But you can search for it in your start menu, Event Viewer, open it up. And if you've never come across this before, it's a very useful tool to see what sort of errors, be it critical errors or just warnings, that your system is throwing. Now, most of these will never flag to you outside of this tool. The PC deals with the error and moves on. And I would hazard a guess that any impact of errors that are shown here is pretty negligible on the overall performance of your system. However, I find it quite good practice to just jump into Event Viewer from time to time, take a look at the errors, what things are popping up, are the things I need to be concerned about, are any of them hardware errors, which are, basically the CPU is having an issue and it's having to sort of repair itself, because of course that could be having an impact to performance. But if you've never come across it before, it's worth taking a look. Once you're inside, there's 4 categories when you're on the home screen. Well, 5, I should say: critical, error, warning, information, audit success. The only 2 you really should be caring about, from my view, are critical and error. Critical will be fairly serious ones where your PC shut down unexpectedly, probably a blue screen, or maybe a power cut forced the system to restart, something like that. I don't have any at the moment. That's good news. But the errors is an interesting one to take a look at. So you can see for me, most of these, I know what they are and I'm not too worried about them. The good thing is if you just double click into any of these, it's going to give you a bit of a description, and then you can basically just copy and paste that description into Google or your search engine of choice, and it'll show you a bit of information around what's causing the error. Do you need to worry about it? Is it a big deal or not? One of the ones I'm noticing that is always thrown currently in iRacing is this one. Not going to read this out, but the error code at the end is 0xc, a bunch of zeros, and 22. And I've done some research on this, and I think it is to do with the anti-cheat system that has recently, or at least in the last 3 or 4 months, been changed within iRacing. I raised a ticket with their support team and let them know that basically, you can see if I double click here, I get this error basically every minute that I'm in the sim. So, I was a bit concerned, would that be having any sort of performance hit? I'm sure it's something that shouldn't be happening. I've seen on the forums for iRacing that it's not isolated. Others have the same issue, and it may be impacting most of us, but obviously a lot of people don't check the event viewer. iRacing support didn't really have an answer, equally didn't seem too worried about it, so who knows, maybe this is just something to live with. I'm not convinced it's having a huge impact on the performance of the system, if any at all, so I'm not really too worried about it. But I do think, if you've never looked at Event Viewer, it's kind of a good tool just to see what errors is the PC throwing, even if you never notice them outside of Event Viewer. You can just see if things are failing in the background, so you can just kind of investigate and see what's going on. And finally, there is one service that is always running on Windows, which generally is considered, not a particularly useful service to be having running in the background when you're gaming. The name of that service is SysMain, SYSMAIN. If you open at the start menu, type services, you'll see that come up and you can just click and you can go in. This is again a bit like the event view. It's quite useful just to see what are the active services that are running in the background, when your computer's on, what runs at startup, etc., etc. And if you scroll down to SysMain, and I'll double click it so you can take a look, Its description is, it maintains and improves system performance over time. Now, there's nothing wrong with this, and then if you've watched my prior video, my recommendation in that was to stop this service and to actually disable it because it doesn't have any negative impact on the running of the system, but having it run in background can consume a little bit of RAM, and it is just another service that is constantly running. I'm not against that advice, but just to be transparent, since I rebuilt this PC probably a couple of months ago now, I've left it on. I never felt there was a difference really, or not a noticeable one from, when I turned SysMain off to now having it switched back on again. I think my guidance would be, if you are RAM constrained on your PC, let's say 16 gig, that should be pretty good, but especially if you're running something like 8 gig, it could be a service that you turn off because, even if it's only consuming a little bit of RAM, it's still not necessarily something you want to have running. But if you have plenty of RAM, 16, I run 32 on here, I don't really think you'll kind of notice the impact. The background as to what the service does in non-technical terms is it uses unused RAM to basically, be able to quickly open programs for you. It kind of learns over time the programs that you typically open and kind of gets them ready so that they open a little bit faster. That's cool. That's super useful on a sort of work production type PC. The reality is, if you're using your PC mainly for gaming, then it probably isn't going to provide a huge benefit. But I keep it on now, couldn't see a huge difference, but if you're RAM constrained, it is a service you can consider turning off just to save yourself a little bit of RAM. And last but not least, I've got some settings guidance if you are an NVIDIA graphics card user. I run a 4090, so I fall into that category. Unfortunately, if you're running AMD, this advice probably doesn't carry over. I haven't run an AMD GPU for some time, so if you have one, don't worry, skip over this section, not going to be useful for you. But for those of you who are running an NVIDIA graphics card, a couple of things I think it's worth knowing and understanding. First of all, you are most likely running either G-Sync or at least a compatible G-Sync monitor. Do double check that you have that set up in the settings here. So you go down to the setup G-Sync, and especially if you're running triple screens, just make sure you've got enable G-Sync or G-Sync compatible ticked, as well as enable for windowed and full screen mode, and not just enabled for full screen mode. Super important if you want to have that smooth variable refresh rate in windowed mode, just to have that ticked. And to enable that, you do have to scroll down to the bottom. It's already open and running for me, but you would get an apply button once you select that. So first, double check, just make sure that G-Sync is set up correctly. Second, head over to Manage 3D Settings. This is the page you'll be presented with, the global settings. Now, back in the day, I would just make all my changes in here because, iRacing was pretty much all I was doing on this PC, so I didn't care. But it's not great, actually, if you do that, because if you're setting things like the power mode to prefer maximum performance, then, it's going to set that the whole time, so it's a bit of a just a kind of a waste of power and a waste of fan. So recommendation is click into program settings. Now I already have iRacing added here. If you did not have iRacing in the drop down list, which you might not, I think I had to go and hunt for it. Be careful you don't select the iRacing UI. It's important to select the iRacing Sim 64 DX11.exe. Bit of a mouthful. It's pretty easy to find if you hit add. It's already here for me, but if I was to hit browse, then you can go into your C drive, program files, x86, iRacing. Then if you scroll down, you will find the iRacing Sim 64 DX11. You could select that, hit open, and then it would appear in this program settings list. Now, once you've done that, that's great. And what this is going to allow you to do is, when the NVIDIA Control Panel recognizes that iRacing is in the sim and running, it will look at this list of settings and it will take guidance from this list in terms of how to run the GPU slightly differently to normal. Here's the changes that I make. There's nothing major. Anisotropic filtering and anti-aliasing mode. Now, I'm led to believe that I think if you leave these on the default setting, NVIDIA Control Panel should just do as the game tells it to do, which is great. So you probably don't need to change these, but for me, I don't think it really does any harm just to make sure the control panel is following the instructions from iRacing. You don't want to do all that work in the iRacing sim around graphics and then have the NVIDIA Control Panel do something different. So I've switched these two settings to application controlled just to make sure that it is listening to what iRacing is telling it. I don't change any of these others, and I'm not technical enough to explain what they all do, so I won't. However, power management mode, when I'm running iRacing, I want it to be giving maximum performance to the GPU, so I do switch that for when I'm running iRacing, so it says prefer maximum performance. And then I'm just going to jump the texture filtering and jump straight to vertical sync for a second. I set this to on as well. Now, there is some debate and there's oodles of work done and articles online about how to get G-Sync, V-Sync, NVIDIA Reflex running in the most effective way. There's a Blur Busters article that I referenced in the last graphics update that I did, and I'll relink it here. I've read that extensively more than once because it's quite complex. And for me to get NVIDIA Reflex running flawlessly every time, the two settings I found that I needed to make sure were switched on for me here were the power management mode to be in prefer maximum performance, and then vertical sync to be on. And then NVIDIA Reflex responds in the game as I would expect, which for me, because I have a 144 Hertz monitor, will restrict the frame rate to 138, and then that sort of gives me the confidence that it's running effectively. So that's why I have vertical sync on. As I said, have a read of the Blur Busters article if you want to get an in-depth understanding of V-Sync, G-Sync, and how that kind of all wraps together. But these are the two settings that work great for me. Now, this texture filtering, there was a fellow YouTuber, and I'll be honest, I can't remember who I was watching in the last couple of weeks, but I saw they had this setting selected. Again, I couldn't notice the difference in game, but it didn't seem to be a problem to switch this on. And you can see in the tooltip here, this tri-linear optimization. It's going to improve texture filtering performance by allowing bilinear filtering on textures in parts of the scene where tri-linear filtering is not necessary. So my basic comprehension of that is it may just, again, improve some FPS in certain areas of the game. So I switched it to on. I didn't really notice difference from before and after, but figured that it can't hurt. So when it comes to NVIDIA, these are the additional settings that I do in the NVIDIA Control Panel, and largely just to make sure that NVIDIA Reflex and G-Sync is working exactly as it's intended to when I'm in the sim. Okay, that is going to be it for this one. I hope none of you have watched that top to tail, because I know there's a significant amount of content in there. I've added as many breaks as I could just so that you can easily find the settings that you're looking for. But hopefully that was useful. It was really important to me to kind of share some of the additional learnings that I've taken on since I last released that first graphics optimization video year and a half, almost 2 years ago now, and also just some of those additional Windows settings, which I think are very easy to miss, if you don't know what you're looking for. As ever, graphics optimization is just a continual learning process. iRacing will change over time. They'll add features, they'll take features away. Every one of our systems is unique. What works for me might not work exactly the same for you, but build your understanding as much as you can around what each of the settings do. Take some time to test them all out where you can, and then hopefully you can kind of find that sweet spot for your system. So coming up, we've got our weekly race streams that are now underway. So they're on Twitch every Wednesday, and then I'm getting the highlights up to YouTube every Thursday. The initial focus is starting out in rookies again and just trying to share that rookies experience with you all. I'm doing the road rookies, so I'm going to be in the MX-5, and I'm just going to talk through some of the kind of things that you hear online, like should I be starting in the pit lane? know, how do I get out of rookies fast? Is that the right thing? I'm just going to share my experience in terms of what has worked for me, what I think the right way to approach rookies is, and the mindset. And well, I'm sure there'll be plenty of scrapes along the way, as the racing can be a little bit rough down in the rookie ranks. But thanks so much for watching. Thanks for tuning in. Let me know in the comments if there's anything I missed, if there's anything you found particularly useful, and I'm excited to get the next set of content out to you in the next month or so.